These are the books I read in October. Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl, and today I'm doing my October wrap-up. Usually October is one of the months that I end up reading a lot more than normal, and this year was no exception to that. I did read a lot of books and a lot of good books. First, I read Jane Eyre, and I did talk about how I was planning on probably reading the manga version of it this time because I've read it multiple times before, and I did. This is the Manga Classics edition. We have a lot of the classics in these manga editions. They're really well done, and this one was as well. I felt like it did a really good job of adapting the story, and where I felt like I still got most of the story, and I really enjoyed the art in it. So this was really fun. It was really fun to be able to feel like I got all of Jane Eyre read and be able to do it in a day. I didn't give it the full 5 stars that I gave Jane Eyre just because I do prefer the original full text, but I think that it's very close to 5 stars. It was really well done. Next, I read Spectres in the Glass House, Jamie Jo Wright's new book. This was a really good one. I was a little bit concerned about it at first. I'm trying to think of how I can, oopsie, the bookmark fell out. Trying to see how I can explain it without spoiling it, but just what I could tell what was happening. I could tell what this book was going to deal with, and so I was a little bit concerned at how it would be dealt with, but it really was done well. By the end, I think it, just like all of her books so far that I have read, it always makes sense by the end, and everything really fits well together. It took me a little bit longer to get into it at first, but then at the end, I could hardly put it down. It's probably one of my favorites by her so far, if not my favorite by her so far. Next, I did a reread of The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. I noticed something this time that I didn't notice the first time I read it. And that is that sometimes it feels like it gets a little bit lost in the descriptions. And so I feel like this book could be about 2/3 this size at least. But I still really enjoyed it. I do think it's a really good story. I feel like it's very compelling and interesting, but yeah, I think that there could be a lot skimmed off the story. Next, I was going to read The Jungle Book, and I've never read that book, but we do have the Manga Classics edition for that as well. And I decided, based on some reviews I got of The Jungle Book, that I would try this first to see what I thought. Just because I was trying to read so many other books this month, I thought that would be a lot easier on me and I would still be able to kind of get a feel for it, knowing how well they do these editions. It's more of a collection of short stories rather than one big story, which I didn't know about The Jungle Book originally, but that is one of the things I picked up from reviews about it. And there were a couple that I liked more than others, but as a whole, I didn't actually enjoy this very much. And I thought the art was okay. I didn't like it as much as the Jane Eyre one. I didn't like the story, obviously, anywhere near as much as Jane Eyre. And based on reviews that I read, I don't know that that would be different with the full text. Eventually, I will probably read the full Jungle Book and see, but I wasn't a huge fan. I think I prefer the Disney movie, which probably is a horrible thing to say, but I say I liked this, I didn't love it. Then I read the next in line in my Sherlock Holmes reading, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. I was a little bit distracted while I was reading through this, and so I feel like it will definitely be a better read on whenever I reread it. So overall, I felt like it was kind of middle of the road with his short story collections, but I did have a couple that I really liked. My favorite one was The Silver Blaze, which was a very mysterious story about a man that was killed in the middle of the night and a horse that was missing. Then I finished Jacob de Chazer with my daughters. We didn't start this one in October. We started this one in September, but we finished it in October. And this is another missionary story of Jacob de Chazer, who was one of Doolittle's raiders in World War II that went in to bomb Japan after Pearl Harbor. And he and a bunch of the other men were captured. And so this tells the story of his time being imprisoned by the Japanese and then also feeling very compelled afterward to go back as a missionary to Japan. It was a really great story and probably my favorite in this series so far. Next, I finished another reread. I read Midnight Sun. This is a huge book and it felt like it this time. It definitely felt longer this time than it did the first time I read it. This is Stephenie Meyer's book, telling Twilight through Edward's perspective. I've wanted to reread the whole Twilight series for a while, and about a year ago I reread Twilight, and my intent was to keep going, but I just didn't. And so I decided to try again, and this time I would read Midnight Sun to begin with it, and then I will move on. I don't know when I'm going to get to the next one, but I do plan on reading the whole series over the next year at some point. This was an interesting book because I'm Team Jacob. For any Twilight people out there, I am Team Jacob. I always have been, and I really didn't like Edward very much. There were times that I liked things about him, but I wasn't a huge fan. I feel like he was very controlling and just, I don't know, got angry and stuff too fast. But this book made me understand him more. I understood what was actually going through his mind. And so once I read this book, I realized that my perception of Edward wasn't exactly who he is. And so I liked him more. Still Team Jacob, still don't love everything about Edward, but I did like him more. She was able to make me appreciate her character more. And I also appreciated other characters, including Bella, more after reading this, because you see her the way other people see her, whereas in Twilight, you're seeing her only through her angsty view of herself. And so seeing her the way everybody else is seeing her, you understand why everybody likes her so much. And then also, you really get more of a well-rounded feel of every character in the Twilight series because of the fact that he can read everybody's minds. How pure Jacob is, how kind Angela is, and then how awful a lot of the other people are. So I do feel like it's a very interesting book and adds a lot to the series if you want that. And I also think it's written better. Probably because, she had quite a few books under her belt by the time she wrote this out. I still think there's some things that could be better in it. However, I don't think you would actually get the whole story, even though you get so much more depth into a lot of things. I don't think you would understand the whole story completely, nor would you understand Bella and her intentions if you didn't read Twilight. So I do think this is something that couldn't necessarily be read by itself. I think you need to read Twilight and know Twilight before you read Midnight Sun. The next book ended up being a DNF. I started reading Exit Nowhere. That was during the spooky 24-hour middle grade readathon. Just sounded really good, and it started out okay. I wasn't really into the characters and the setting right away, but I felt like it had the potential to be really good. However, I mentioned on here before that there are certain things that I don't read in a children's book, and this very quickly got into talking about one of the kids' two dads. And it wasn't just an in passing, it became a whole conversation. And so I put it down and I DNF'd that one. And then I started reading The Sherlock Society by James Ponte. He's the man who wrote City Spies, the series that my daughter and I have been enjoying. And this is his newest book. And I don't have it to show right now because she is currently reading it. It tells the story of some kids who over the summer decide to start this Sherlock Society where they are figuring out mysteries, and their grandpa gets involved. There are a lot of family dynamics between the parents and the grandparent and these kids that felt really real, and I really enjoyed it. It's a lot like his other books as far as the writing goes and his style. So if you don't enjoy his other books, you probably wouldn't enjoy it. But if you do enjoy his other books, I think you would like it a lot. The next book, also a middle grade I started, was The Tattooed Potato and Other Clues. And this was written by the same person who wrote The Westing Game, which I love. And so I had never read this and decided I would try it out. And I DNF'd this one as well. It wasn't anything bad. I just couldn't get into it. I just didn't care. And so since I had so many other books lined up, I just put it down and forgot about it. I did do a quick reread of The Dollhouse Caper by Jean S. O'Connell. This is a book I've had since I was a kid, and I've read it many times. It's just a simple little story about a dollhouse and the little people in the dollhouse that come alive. It's just really fun. It's just a very fun little story. I read it in about a half an hour. Then I read the George MacDonald Twilight Collection. This is a collection of short stories by George MacDonald that are more spooky or supernatural. The first one in here is called The Portent, and it was actually more of a novella. It was not short story length. The rest of them are pretty short, but that one took up almost half the book. In fact, more than half of the book. This is all the first story right here, and then this is the rest of the stories. And I'm glad because that one was actually my favorite one. It felt really fleshed out. It felt like a full story. This could have been just that, and I would have been happy with it. I even wrote down some quotes from it. Our life is not a dream, but it may become a dream, and perhaps ought to become one. Down the hill of night is up the hill of morning in other lands. There is a love that tears and destroys, and there is a love that enfolds and saves. As far as the rest of the stories go, there were 4 other ones: The Cruel Painter, Uncle Cornelius, His Story, The Haunted Mirror, and The Gray Wolf. And I rated all of those in about the 3 to 3.5 range. They were all okay. I'm not a huge short story fan, and so sometimes I have a harder time getting really engaged into them. But these were well done, and I enjoyed all of them. But The Portent was definitely the best part of it. And I really enjoyed reading more from George MacDonald. I really like his writing style. And right after saying that I don't read very many short stories, I read the final Sherlock Holmes, The Return of Sherlock Holmes. And this was my favorite, I think, of all of his short story collections. I liked almost all of them. It got a little bit slower toward the end, but it started out so strong. I was surprised at how much I was liking every single story that I was reading. My favorites in the collection were the first 2, The Empty House and The Norwood Builder. And I'm just really glad to have finally finished. I have really enjoyed reading all of them, and I do look forward to reading them again. The next thing I finished was another thing I did not start in October. This was started in the summer. Creation to Babel, a commentary on Genesis from Ken Ham. And this is Genesis 1 through 11. And I did this on Sundays with my husband and my 2 daughters. And this was a reread for me, but none of them had ever gone through it before. So it was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. And then I finally finished Joy in Christ's Presence by Charles Spurgeon. Beautiful Minutia and Chrissy's Purple Library and Dia at Novel Idea, they went through this last year, and they had live videos about each section of chapters, but I didn't have it at that time, and so I decided to get it later after listening to them talk about it. And I've taken my time. I started late last spring, and I've just taken my time really going through it slowly. And every time I finished a section of chapters, I would go back and watch their video, and I got so much out of this book. I really enjoyed it. I'm so glad that I decided to read it. And I do plan on reading this out loud with my family as well eventually. And then another book I did not start in October but finished in October is Truth Changes Everything by Dr. Jeff Myers. This is a book my mom and I got at the homeschool convention in Colorado, not this past summer, but the summer before that. And I read it pretty soon after we got back, but we decided to read it together this year, throughout the whole year. And so every month we would read a certain amount of chapters, and then we would get together and talk about it. And so we finished this in October, and were able to discuss the last couple of chapters a couple of weeks ago. This is a really good book, especially for the world that we're living in right now. I think that he makes so many good points, and it's very thought-provoking, a lot to discuss. It's a really good book to read with others, I think. And this is not a very exciting book to look at, but I finished The Journey to the Center of the Earth. I really liked this book too. I did not love it as much as Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. I felt like it started out really strong. I was really sucked into the story, but occasionally it would get very technical and info dump. And the way it actually wrapped up kind of surprised me. I didn't know anything about the book going into it, besides what I think everybody kind of knows. I've read a few books by him now, and this is probably my least favorite of the 3, but I still did enjoy it. Then I had another reread of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is a very short book. I read this in a day, and I enjoyed it. I think I enjoyed it even more the second time around because I knew the whole story, and so I was able to just kind of settle in and enjoy it. Whereas the first time I was trying to find out what was going to happen. I mean, I think a lot of us know the story behind Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde somewhat, but I didn't know all the details the first time. What's so funny to me is how different it is from, say Treasure Island. And so it's fun to see his range, I guess. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. I think it's a really interesting book, and especially since it's so short, I think most people would enjoy reading it. And then the very last book I read in October was The Premonition at Wither's Farm by Jamie Jo Wright. I had another book by her that I wanted to read as well, but this just took me the last few days of October, and so I knew I wasn't going to get any further. I really wasn't sure at first how I was going to feel about this book because of the subject matter. The character in it, she is a amateur healer. She's trying to be kind of a doctor, but she doesn't have any training. And her mom is someone she's basically a medium. She tries to speak with the dead. And at the very beginning, there is a seance scene. And so I was very concerned at first going into this. How is this going to be something that is actually okay in a Christian book? And that kind of thing really bothers me. And so I just wasn't sure. I wasn't sure I was going to read the whole book, let alone like the whole book. But by the end, it was actually really faithful. There was a lot of really good faith content in it, especially concerning those things, because there was a character who basically talked through those things and why they're not okay. And there was some really good conversations between the characters in the future and the past timeline in this book that really got me thinking. And so by the time I was done with it, I realized that while this wasn't my favorite of her books, there were quite a few conversations I had with different family members about things that came up in this book that it was really thought-provoking. And so I actually ended up really enjoying it because of that. And I think it ended well. She is just so good at writing spooky books that mix with faith content. I don't know how she does it, especially with how many come out, but I do really enjoy her writing. Hey guys, Editing Cheryl here. I realized I forgot to say some of the trigger warnings for that book. There's murder and there's the seance that I talked about, but there's also miscarriage in this book and a lot of talk about loss that way. So I wanted to add that real quick. I'm going to share the 3 books that my family members enjoyed in October. My oldest daughter started Hunger Games, but she DNF'd it. She just wasn't getting into it, which surprised me. Maybe she'll try again another time. Maybe she won't. But then I had her read Dracula for October. I thought that she would probably like it, but I just wasn't sure. And she ended up loving it. She says it's a great work of literature. In her paper that she wrote about it, she talked about how it was the first epistolary novel I've given her that she actually really liked. And so she used to think she didn't like that writing style, but now she realizes that she does sometimes. I love all of the books I gave to her, but this was the first one she did. She really enjoyed it. And then my youngest daughter finished Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and she really enjoyed that as well. And then Doug was reading Timeline by Michael Crichton for the books that I had assigned him this year for fun, and he just wasn't getting into it. I don't know why. I thought for sure he would love that book, because I do, and it seemed to be something that would interest him a lot, but he just wasn't enjoying it very much. And so I asked him if he would prefer it if I switched it out and changed it to something else. And he said yes. And I said, okay, well, since you liked 1984 so much, why don't you read Animal Farm by George Orwell? And he read this over a couple of days. It was just like 1984. He started it and couldn't put it down until he finished it. Really liked it. Both of them have been given 4 stars by him. It was a really good reading month. My favorite book of the whole month was probably The Return of Sherlock Holmes. And that's a hard one, but it would have been Jane Eyre probably. Except I usually don't pick rereads for my favorite of the month. So the Jane Eyre manga and Return of Sherlock Holmes were probably my favorite, but I did enjoy almost every book I read. So it was really enjoyable. I would love to hear if you read any of these books in October as well, or if you've read them before, and what your favorite book in October was.